have come here to bury the last remnant of the Cold War in the Americas.
A stirring speech in Havana by President Obama, but will it change anything there? Skeptics say no, optimists say maybe.
And right now, breaking in this hospital in the Keys and also in Miami-Dade, a group of Cubans who were intercepted by the Coast Guard at sea, and they found some aboard with gunshot wounds.
Donald, you're a sniveling coward, and leave Heidi the hell alone.
Ted Cruz and Donald Trump go mano a mano over each other's wife. How low can this race go? We'll take it to the round table.
Good morning and welcome. Happy Easter to the faithful. It has been such a busy news week. Some events hopeful and some tragic and frightening.
This weekend, investigators have made more arrests in the terror attacks in Brussels. The horrific attacks there took dozens of lives, wounded hundreds of people. They have been tied directly to the same terror network that pulled off the attacks in Paris last November. Officials in Europe are fearful more attacks to come.
In Cuba, President Obama's visit made history. Raul Castro made history by answering questions from American press, all but denying Cuba has political prisoners. And then that extraordinary joint news conference that ended in that awkward arm-raising, wrist-dangling moment.
The highlight of the trip was the president's speech on Tuesday, broadcast live on Cuban state TV. The president saying Cuba and the U.S. have so much in common despite different political and economic systems. The president called for the Cuban people to be able to speak freely, assemble peacefully, and choose their political leaders in free and fair elections.
A lot to talk about with our guest today, Dr. Frank Mora, director of the Latin American and Caribbean Studies Center at Florida International University and former Deputy Secretary of Defense for the Western Hemisphere.
And our crew just back from Havana, I mean literally back yesterday, Council Vela, who covered the president's trip and the Rolling Stones concert.
And just back also from producing all that coverage in Cuba, Local 10 News producer Michelle Lacamore, whose trip was also a very personal one, a chance to reconnect with loved ones on the island. So great to have you in. I haven't seen you in a couple of weeks. That's not usual.
Well, seen you on TV, but it's great to have you here. Dr. Frank Mora, let's begin with, I think, the big question. Will President Obama's trip to Cuba, in the long run, in the short run, make any difference?
We don't know, frankly. I mean, the president is making a bet, Michael, that engagement, dialogue, empowerment will make a difference. But it's a bet. What we do know is that 55 years of the previous policy didn't result in the outcome that we wanted.
Right.
And can we just say this morning, talk about change, no change in the number of Cuban migrants trying to make it to shore, and in fact, an increase since the president announced his new plans and the new connections and the new rules, and 6 of them are now on Cuban soil, I mean U.S. soil. The Cubans who are here have all been here because they had gunshot wounds this morning, and here's some video that we're just getting into the newsroom. And the question, I guess, becomes, Hatzel, maybe you can address this. Do you think, is it possible that seeing the Coast Guard, realizing they'd be interdicted, they injured, wounded, shot themselves expressly to get here on soil?
Yeah, listen, it is clear that these Cubans coming now are doing it for economic reasons mostly, and they'll do anything because they're tired of their way of life. They want a better way of life, and simply they, as you've seen, they've come through Central America, South America, from Ecuador. I mean, this is outrageous what's happening, but it's truly telling a story of their plight and really their desperateness to get here.
Desperation, yeah.
Yes.
And Michelle, is this an indication of exactly how desperate they are and their fear that wet foot, in-foot will be wiped off the books, and when it does, they will not get free entry into the U.S.?
Absolutely. I think there's a rush now. They probably believe that this is our last chance, perhaps, to make it. And I also think that maybe perhaps there'll be an influx because of the president's speech, because it was so hopeful. Perhaps now they think, whoa, we should go now.
But isn't that ironic? Because, Frank, the intent of the president's speech was, we're going to make life better here.
Yeah.
On the island, we're going to encourage civil society, the cuenta propistas, the small business people. I mean, that is the whole thrust of the policy.
You know, Michael, what the president has unleashed is expectations. People on the island are expecting a better standard of living, social and economic reforms, and that's a false expectation because Raul Castro is not going to do that on his own. And what's going to create is a tension within the island that is either going to confront and push further against the regime or leave the island.
Do you know what was so amazing about that speech is the president busted a myth. No longer do the Cuban people, can they think that the U.S. is an enemy? They heard it straight from the horse's mouth. And so what do you think happens now that the Cuban people know that what they might find is so difficult to live under, or repression or hardship or scarcity, is not the fault of the United States?
It's very interesting because I think the president went to Cuba as a beacon of hope, a symbol of change for the country, but more so economically than politically, at least from the Cubans that we spoke to on the island. I think what they want is the embargo to be lifted. They believe that we are the reason why they have suffered so much. But at the same time, when you ask them about politics, perhaps the change in their policies, they don't really want that change, or it seems they don't want that kind of change.
They don't know anything else.
Exactly.
They don't
One
know
of the
any
cab
other
drivers I talked to said, you know, these are pretty words. They give us hope. But at the end of the day, what happens to my bottom line? How do I feed my children tomorrow? And that sort of gives you some perspective as to what they want. They want short-term changes, and I don't think the president's speech is going to provide that for them.
Well, speaking of cab drivers and anybody who works in tourism, it's almost a given. We've reported this. You've certainly reported this, that if you work for the state, the average salary is, what, $24, $25 a month. But if you work in tourism, Michelle, if you work as a bartender or anywhere where you get tips, you can make $400, $500 a month. So the disparity between state employees and anybody in tourism is huge.
Absolutely, and our cab drivers, architects, accountants, professionals that had no choice. They feel they had no choice but to leave their professions to become taxi drivers, to work in restaurants, wherever the tourist dollar is.
And they jokingly welcome every big event because they say there's always an influx of reporters and people, and then the Cuban government starts fixing up roads, and they say this is not only an influx in people, it's an influx in money for us.
You got someone's pothole fixed.
Yes, yes.
So let's talk a little bit about the amount of press on that island was staggering. I mean, we could see it from here. Did you feel like you could maneuver around? Were you allowed to go to these events? Could you freely shoot what you wanted to?
Well, the big events where the president was, it was closed press. It was selected. We were close enough to the president for La Plaza de la Revolución when he laid the wreath for Jose Marti. We were there. We weren't there for the speech. We weren't and not because we were banned, just because it was closed press and there was so much. There were so many journalists.
Well, when you cover politics, as you both know, there's typically pool. So there was plenty of American pool press and Cuban pool press covering sort of every step of the way that we would get easily access to.
So would you characterize it just like covering one of those big events here, or were there different layers of security for different reasons?
I think there's definitely different layers of security. It's much more complex on the island. You don't easily get to places. I mean, when he arrived that day on Sunday, it was as if Havana had been shut down. I mean, people were not out and about. I mean, it really reminded you that you were in a police state.
Frank Mora, I think that the crux of the president's speech had to be human rights in Cuba. And it took him a while to get there. I thought it was an elegant speech, very well balanced. He was certainly walking a delicate line. But when and there was Raul Castro sitting just up in the audience, when he got to the point where he said, I believe, he counts it in personal terms, but I believe that it is the basic human rights of people to be able to speak their minds without being harassed and intimidated, to gather, to practice the religion of their choice. Did he say that strongly enough?
I think so. And the way he says it, and he repeated it, I think, Michael. And then he said something that I've mentioned many times and he highlighted, is that the future of the Cubans is in the hands of the Cuban people. That might sound obvious, you know, redundant, whatever.
But for the president of the United States
to say that in Cuba, considering the history of U.S.-Cuba relations, is a very powerful message. Yes, we're going to speak on behalf of human rights, democracy, and abuse, and we're going to facilitate, we're going to try to continue creating spaces for the Cuban people, but at the end of the day, it's up to you.
I will say, even I was in Little Havana reporting sort of the counterpoint to what you all were doing in Cuba, and I will say even the people I know as hardliners that we have been talking to for decades here in the heart of exile had nothing but praise for the president's speech. Yeah. Can we take a quick break right now? This seems like a good point to break, because another really big subject are the family ties that this new open relationship is providing, and we're going to talk all about that when we come right back. We are back talking about the president's fascinating trip to Cuba. Frank Mora from FIU, Hatzel Vela, our reporter, Michelle Lackamore, our producer, just back from Cuba. And one of the really interesting things, both professionally and personally, was Michelle and your visit to your family and your reconnection. And it's such a model of so many family stories in South Florida and in Cuba. How was that maneuvering your whirlwind professional duties of producing that coverage and getting to spend time with the family?
Well, obviously, it's a lot of work, and I try to balance it out because our time there is limited, but I'm able to do that, and it's very important. They're very supportive. I've met them before. I met them, my mom's side of the family. She's the eldest of 9. She came at the age of 14 in 1957, 2 years before the revolution. She stayed here, they stayed there, and I met them for the first time about 7 years ago. So every time I go, it's learning more about my family.
And you met them 7 years ago,
Yeah.
but have really connected with them because of the new rules in place.
Exactly, exactly. So it's
What's it like for them?
they're very proud. They're very proud, very happy that we are able to be a part of each other's lives after so long. So it's very emotional.
Well, this idea of reconciliation, I think, is just, is it not? You're nodding, Frank. I think it's really at the heart also of what the president tried to do. And then when you think about the fact that at least we know the excellent piece in the Herald, a dozen or 15 or so really prominent Cuban-American businessmen, people like Mike Fernandez, the healthcare mogul, and Jorge Perez from the Related Group, and Joe Ariola, former Miami city manager, many others are down there because they believe in this initiative. Only a couple of years ago, they would have been pariahs for saying this publicly. And Carlos Saladrigas, who was also there, told me that, in fact, when he started the Cuba City Group, he was called a pariah.
Yeah, and I couldn't imagine any of these gentlemen wanting to go to Cuba because there was still that antagonism, right? But this issue of reconciliation, as you said, is at the core of this issue, right? Your story, the story of many people who suffered and sacrificed. And there's a lot of pain, Michael. And the key to moving forward is to be able not to forget that pain, but moving and forward and navigating through that pain. Because at the end of the day, Cubans on the island, Cubans in Miami are going to have to go through this process for the benefit and the future of people on the island.
Can you talk a little bit about how do you balance that, the reconciliation and the efforts to do all of that, with the pain here of watching the president and his family and grandma and families, the kids, what looked like to them as spring break with a dictator? And I think that was a really interesting viewpoint here, because even people who understand what progress might be made are looking at this and saying, wait, the optics here just don't work for me.
Yeah, it depends on how you look at it, right? I think the optics were wonderful, right? To be able to see the President of the United States, an African-American President of the United States, speaking to a very large population of Afro-Cubans, right? That optic of arriving at the airport, that speech, that press conference, right? Those are things that have value, substance, really, that will lead to the process of change. And I think we have to, I was once like that, I have to look beyond that and think about, Glenna, what will work? What is practical? Foreign policy cannot be done through emotions and the past. We need to look forward and think about what is in the interest of the United States, and in the end also in the Cuban people.
Let's talk for a second about the famous news conference, where it really wasn't a news conference. It was going to be statements after they had had their private meetings between Raul Castro and President Obama, and it turned into a news conference. And Michelle, I guess in over half a century, Raul Castro, to my knowledge, has never, in a public forum like this, taken a question, and he sure didn't like the question that he got.
It was very surreal to see him take part in a press conference, and the first question off the bat was about dissidents and political prisoners, and he was not happy.
You know, that almost seemed like it was planned, because if you watch, President Obama actually chose, let's see, you asked the question, right?
That was his setup, wasn't it?
Yeah.
That's what's been talked about, that the president has done this before in a sort of friendly kind of way, like playing, hey, let's kind of just answer a couple questions. And it looked like a setup, because you could see that Castro was not ready for it. What's interesting about this, though, is that it was replayed in Cuban TV, but only the press conference part, not the questions. But the live version did play out, so those who were watching that got to see that.
Right.
So-
The question, again, if you did not see it, was why do you have political prisoners in Cuba, and why don't you just release them? And Raul Castro's answer was, political prisoners? Give me a list of names. They'll be released by nightfall.
We don't have any. Give us a list of
And
names.
they were
The
given
next
lists.
morning, there were plenty of lists being
Well,
disseminated
by that
of all the political
afternoon,
prisoners.
I had received 3 lists from various groups, and was glad to have provided them to Mr. Castro if he had wanted them.
Did you see or hear any talk of dissidents or the president's meeting with dissidents there,
At that press conference?
or anywhere where you were during the couple of days?
Yes, there was a meeting with dissidents that took place shortly after the speech.
Yes, but did people know that? I guess the question is, did
Did
people on the
Cubans know
island,
that?
did Cubans
No.
know what was going on?
No,
They didn't know.
no. Cubans only saw what was aired live on TV, which was that press conference, his speech, and I believe that's about it, and his departure.
There is some thought, Frank, that the repression will get worse before it gets better, because of the past instances where every time something looks to be good happening, the Cuban government cracks down.
I tend to agree, but I think it's more an example of a fear, insecurity, and disorientation that the regime feels, right? When they feel that they want to make sure that the message gets across, that there's not going to be change or not the kind of change you want, they repress. And to me, that's a sign of insecurity. They seem to be improvising as they go through this process. This is a different play for them, Glenn. They're used to the 55 years of confrontation. They knew how to play that game perfectly.
And they were
now they're in a
superb at it.
different game, new rules, and they're moving around trying to make sense of it. They're making mistakes. They're noticing the tensions of the inequality that Michelle talked about, and they're trying to see, how do we move through this? How do we keep the balance? That's a very delicate balance.
Part of the insecurity, I feel, is like the way that they portrayed their visit, which is what we talked to on air, right? Like, they didn't want it portrayed as this really popular American president, lots of crowds here coming to see him. You didn't see that. And I think that may have been purposely done.
All right, before we run out of time, we must at least mention the Rolling Stones. You were there on Friday night in Havana, and what a moment, I guess. I mean, here's a regime that had basically outlawed rock and roll years ago, you know, corrupt Western influence.
Subversive.
You know, subversive. Right. And here they are, you know, rocking with, and he's my contemporary, so Mick Jagger, glad he's still out there. But tell us about that.
It was an amazing experience, because oftentimes Mick talked to the crowd in Spanish, of course. And one of the things he said that I took away from what he said, years ago, you could not hear our music, but here we are. Times are changing. That was one of the best messages I heard from the concert. He kept saying little things in there. He talked about little freedom without being too political. It was just amazing to see the crowd sort of react to it and be there in that moment.
So they got some satisfaction.
You're absolutely right. Got some satisfaction.
All right.
So,
Well,
Frank, Laura, Michelle, so great to have you in. Happy Easter,
you.
and thank you so much.
thank you.
Thank you.
And after the break, taking it all.
We will take it all to the Powerhouse Roundtable. Stick around. If ever there was a week that cried out for informed opinion and mindful analysis, this was it.
And a great roundtable today for exactly that. Nancy Ankrum is the editorial page editor of the Miami Herald, and we are so glad to welcome her back to the roundtable.
Thank you.
Welcome back as well to Bernadette Pardo, a longtime journalist in South Florida in television, radio, and newspapers, and you can hear her weekday mornings on WQBA Radio. And another familiar face, that of Marlon Hill, Miami attorney with the Hamilton, Miller and Berthasell firm, also past president of the Caribbean Bar Association, a veteran roundtable, as it were. Good morning.
And we are so glad
Like the
you're
Rolling
here.
Stones, you know, hey.
Yeah.
I wish we had that soundtrack this morning.
Bernie Pardo, there's hardly anyone I respect more for the coverage of Cuba over a long time, decades, than your reporting. So let me just get your reactions to the president in Cuba, what you saw, what you heard.
Oh, I thought it was unforgettable, like Nat King Cole's song. It was just amazing. First of all, I'm a speechwriter. At first, I started out as a speechwriter, and the speech was awesome. The speech did what it had to do, and without preaching, without offending anybody. He said, I have had people call my radio show who are very conservative. And they said, I'm a Republican, I didn't vote for Obama, I never will vote for Obama. But he did the job. He did a good job. People could not. There were other moments, too. It started out a little bit grimly with that airport, and
Well,
no
that
one
was
even
cold.
to hand them an umbrella.
That was
They had
cold.
2 spies receiving them instead of Castro. You know, it was very weird. But he overcame that not only with his speech, but I thought a particularly poignant moment was to hear a Cuban military band playing the national anthem in the Palace of the Revolution. I mean, you know, hello. It was a moment.
That was really remarkable, even for people who may not be Cuban American, who, especially if you live in South Florida, you realize what that means, and to actually witness that and hear it was stunning.
And he touched all bases, not only with his speech, he met with the dissidents that he said he was going to meet with, and he had the foresight that no one else has had to have them picked up by a van from the embassy so they
because-
would not be beaten up. And then he met with them. He was very attentive to them and human, they said. He met with a very popular Cuban comic, because he knows that Cubans are best with humor. In order to communicate, that the best way to do it is with humor. I wrote this week that the only thing he has left to do is run for president of Cuba, and that would put an end to the succession
Which
problem.
might
he's
get some of those.
unlikely to do, but he certainly planted seeds for the future and hope. You know, with this being before the weekend of Easter, it's really an opportunity, and Easter is really about reconciliation, right? You know, so I think that with him being there with his family, his mother-in-law, which I thought was a very important diplomatic, subtle message that he sent, but planting seeds of the future and the hope was very important to
Yeah.
to the
Nancy,
speech.
your page at the Herald editorialized glowingly about the president's speech. You clearly think that he did
Absolutely.
hit all the right notes.
He hit all the right notes in just the right tone. It was not a lecture. There was no guilt. There was no finger shaking. Finger wagging. You know, he said, I prefer a democracy. I prefer freedom. You know, the question now is, and has been, will his visit make a change? Well, of course it will. This is part of a continuum. I don't think that one particular change will come from this particular visit, but it's part of a continuum of the loosening, of the opening up of, yes, the democratization that we know is coming in Cuba.
I think that I agree totally with what you said, but I think also that the most important thing is what Frank Moro said here before, is that he said the future of Cuba is in the hands of Cubans. For 50 years, everybody's tried to make it the other way, you know, where the United States is the great savior. No, you got to get your act together if you want this.
And his speech also hinted at the definition as to the people of Cuba has to include both the people of Cuba on the island and off the island as well.
Yeah, he was speaking to South Florida particularly. I mean, Cubans in the diaspora everywhere, but particularly, I mean, I thought that line, if you want to see what Cubans can do, you
Look at
know,
Miami.
we have a good example. It's called Miami.
Yeah.
I mean, that was
Yeah.
a big moment here.
Yeah, it was brilliant.
Yeah.
One of the really remarkable things that come out of that was Miami Beach's mayor was there and brought back this idea of a Cuban consulate in Miami Beach after Miami's mayor said no way here. The Miami-Dade Commission actually voted on a resolution against it. But the mayor said he wanted to know, he wanted people in Cuba to know that they would be welcome in Miami Beach.
Well, you know,
Whereas
a little bit of Miami-Dade County politics live in Havana. What's
Right,
the surprise
exactly.
there?
Well, but here's the
Little bit of
question is,
grandstanding,
a consulate is, it would be the government here in an office, but it is a service, a building of
Obviously,
services.
and
Right,
the
exactly.
to
biggest
the people.
population of Cuban Americans is here. Most Cuban Americans who got here after 70 need a Cuban passport to go to Cuba.
Right.
So why should you make them go all the way to
To
Washington
Tampa.
or Tampa or
Yeah.
wherever?
Exactly.
Maybe we need some
Exactly.
reconciliation right here in Miami.
Daily.
Bernie, I have to ask you the same question that I asked our guest earlier, and that is, when you see people of the stature of Jorge Perez, of the related group, Manny Medina, Mike Fernandez, Attorney Ralph Patino, Joe Arreola, Carlos Gutierrez, the former Secretary of Commerce under George W. Bush, all these people are in Havana supporting the president, supporting this initiative. I mean, this would have been unthinkable not that long ago.
It would have been unthinkable before that 17th of December. Unfortunately, among many Cubans in my audience particularly, they're a little bit suspicious of this
What do
group.
they want out of
They
this?
think they're going to Cuba to do a zafra, to make money. And that they're trying to get in before everybody else
Yeah.
too.
Can I jump in and simply say, I know Mike Fernandez, I've asked him about this, and he is emphatic. He is not there to invest, not there to make money. He is there because he believes he has expertise to help the people of Cuba. And I think most
No,
of these...
I believe that, and that's
Yeah.
what they all tell me, but there's always that suspicion because
Sure.
there is, let's get real, there's going to be a lot of money made once these contracts are all ironed out.
Right.
And
Right.
Yeah,
Right,
like
and-
the people from Starwood and
Sure.
Cisco and the other companies that are going
Exactly.
in.
Why would we expect anything less from businessmen? You know, there's no mystery here. There's no mystery here. The good things that they want to do aside.
And I guess it's okay to make all that money as long as you're doing good at the same time, and that's kind
Certainly
of the American way, is it not?
Your corporate citizenship has to be balanced
Right,
with
of
human
course.
rights and what you want for the
Right,
best for the country.
exactly.
That's why the conversation is not only on island but off island as to what happens with the Cuban
But it's
economy.
really complex because honestly, it's not such a huge market. 11 million Cubans who are basically making $20 a month, most of them. Who's going to buy? Who's going to support their consuming habits? It's going to be the exiles, I think,
Right.
because they're
Right.
the trick here is to jumpstart an economy that right now does not exist. And 90% of the Cubans depend on the government. And the smartest thing is to get them off that dependence. But how do you do it? I'm not a...
And how do you do it without dealing with the Cuban government? Because the military, the strongest institution in Cuba, runs tourism.
And also, you know, I think the immediate benefit is going to be, of course, a lot of tourism, a lot of it. But honestly, do you want everybody to be a waiter or a busboy? Or,
No.
you know, I think they should aspire to do a lot bigger things than that.
Yeah. Let me ask you if I can, Marlon, we'll just sort of go around the table. The moment at the end of the news event, news conference, whatever you want to call it, where a very rattled and I thought kind of old crotchety Raul Castro reaches over for the arm of
We're
the
going to reenact
president.
it? Is that what you're going to
Well, I almost reached over, but you're the wrong gender. But anyway, tried to raise his arm, and the president wasn't having anything of it. Here's the video. I mean, talk about awkward. What was that?
Well, besides the awkwardness, you have to talk about the body language. You know, what was he attempting to show? What message was he trying to
exactly.
send?
What was he attempting to show?
That
Who knows?
Here, a show of strength, and that you're in my country, and you're saying.
Or we're
all
both
this-
in the same
Well,
page, which they're
yeah.
not.
He was attempting
Yeah.
a show of solidarity. Now, in which way and whose ideology? Well, that's unclear.
He looked like a
And-
dinosaur. right?
Exactly.
He did.
And
He did.
Obama was not going to do a fist pump.
Yeah.
Right,
It was not going to happen.
That was not going to happen. That was not going to
And he
happen.
showed her anyway, so it kind of looked like he was doing an alley hoop with basketball. It just didn't work.
Yeah, it was one of the most awkward moments. But I think you're right. The question, and you put it very well, Nancy, is what did it mean?
Right.
I mean, was it supposed to be solidarity, or we're together, or
He
you know?
probably was feeling, I'm glad this is over, you know.
But you could see the president was very conscious of what those
What a,
optics might have
what a
been.
contrast. You know, a president who is like rational, friendly, answers questions,
Yeah.
and this guy banging on the...
Right.
Yeah, exactly. All right, hold your thoughts. We have many more questions, many more things to discuss with the roundtable. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We are in the midst of our usual roundtable. Robust would be kind of a fancy word to say. We're having a good time here. Let's move on to the war of words between Donald Trump and Ted Cruz over their wives. And I have to say, when I saw Ted, and we used it in the headline, Ted Cruz saying, "Donald, you're a sniveling coward. Stay the hell away from Heidi." I mean, we're 8 months from the election, and we're down in this gutter level. I mean, Nancy, what the heck is going on?
We've been in the mud for a while. I mean, we've already talked about small hands and what that means. So where else is there to go but to attack the wives? This was the result of an anti-Trump PAC releasing an ad of a nude Melania. She don't look that great. She's kind of skinny. And come on. I've been in Miami too long, my standards of, and Donald striking back at Heidi Cruz, saying, don't make me spill her secrets.
Lying Ted, don't make me spill the beans. Yeah.
Right, exactly, exactly. However, and as Carl Hiaasen said in a column today in the Herald, he said, Ted actually came out looking like a gentleman, saying, Donald, you have a beautiful wife. Heidi is the love of my life. Let's move beyond this.
Can I say, I just feel terrible for Melania and Heidi, because once again, women are being used as objects in a place that it just, well, never is that right. But it's just evolved to someplace like this, and in a context of the war on women that everyone thinks Donald Trump is.
Glenna.
We're not in a
Michael,
good
at the
place.
risk of being outnumbered on this panel with Women's History Month, we certainly need to leave the women out of it. It's just another distraction, a lot of noise. I feel that it's going to create a deeper fracture within the GOP going into the summer. The fracture on the other side of the aisle with the Democrats is not as deep, but who can heal the fastest? We'll see.
I think it's been happening all along. It's just that the dirty war has spilled onto the front headlines.
Right.
It's always been happening. They've had really scurrilous campaigns in many places, here in Miami for a while.
Sure.
Right,
And it's
exactly.
just that now the protagonists of the whole drama are themselves spewing out the lines of the coarseness of the campaign.
And the GOP, which is the mainstream GOP, which is shocked at all of this, really laid the foundation for this, and did decades ago. And so any protestations otherwise are, them protesting too much.
And these types of nuances too, and Nancy, voters do pay attention to that. There's a difference between beating your chest strength and leadership, right? So how you react to how you speak about women, how do you speak about other parts of our society, voters are paying attention to these things.
Well, in fact, I just saw a poll this morning that 73% of American women, 73% disapprove of Donald Trump. And when you take Hispanics and African-American voters, I don't see, if he is the nominee, how he puts together some kind of a coalition that would get him a victory.
Some people say that that if you're a Republican and you get to election night and that's your choice, you would rather vote for what you have that's a Republican than for a Democrat. So I would not count too much on this huge majority, as he would
I
say.
wouldn't either. And I think, it's going to be very hard for him to, as politicians usually do, after they play to the fringes, step to the middle. It's going to be very difficult with what else is on the record.
Interesting, this week, right before those photographs became the big headline, Jeb Bush endorsed Ted Cruz.
Very timidly.
And just
At long distance.
and late, and I guess the question is, does that even matter at this
I don't
point?
think endorsements help really on both sides of the aisle much. No, I think the voters are really focused on a number of other nuances. And even with Governor Scott endorsing Trump after.
Well,
And
but that
Pam
was
Bondi, the
meaningless. I
Attorney
mean, it's
General.
one thing to endorse a candidate before the election and try to help the candidate of your choice. You do it the day after. What difference does
But
it make?
I think it shows the desperation of what's called the establishment in terms of a train they can't stop, and they're trying it any which way now.
All right, I want to mention some of the reaction to this terrible tragedy in Brussels, at least domestic reaction. Here, Nancy, we had Ted Cruz saying that he's going to carpet bomb ISIS and that Muslim neighborhoods have to be patrolled more closely by police, as if we have. Maybe in Detroit there may be Muslim neighborhoods, but I mean, there's no other place in the country that really has Muslim neighborhoods, and there seems to be a freedom of religion clause that would protect and prevent police from doing anything like that.
I think Ted Cruz is someone who is smart enough to know all of that. But again, it plays to the pit. It rouses the rabble.
Absolutely.
And I think that's all he feels the need to do.
And it shows a profound misunderstanding of the crisis at hand. Because as you say, Michael, the big difference here is that we don't have Muslim enclaves. And the big problem in Europe, they have not been able to assimilate their
And
Muslim populations.
not to make it too personal, but I made a point the last time I was in Paris to go out to some of the Muslim neighborhoods, and when you walk through those neighborhoods,
Different countries.
it is a different country entirely. I mean, just as in Berlin, you go to some Turkish neighborhoods but they're not quite as isolated. The Muslim neighborhoods in France are separate and apart.
And the sad thing, Michael, is that we're not at war with the faith, Muslim faith. Yes. We're at war with persons who are using whatever their faith is. It really doesn't matter, but we're not at war with the Muslim faith. And that's a very important concept that I think that is being to the fringes.
And religion is being used as a flag. That's a very worrisome thing. Because a lot of to me, what it equates to, it's kids here who join gangs. For them, ISIS is the gang. And the gang gives them validity, gives them a family, gives them, you know,
to somebody who does not otherwise have something like that, or a support system, or even hope for their own future. And that's the draw.
Exactly.
But Nancy, do you think that when Ted Cruz says something like that, do other neighborhoods, other minority neighborhoods, hear that and think there but for the grace of God go I?
Well, I think other minority neighborhoods, I think African-American neighborhoods, I think poor Latino neighborhoods say, you know, we've kind of been on lockdown for decades here. And we understand the implications of this, and this is wrong.
Before we run out of time, let's just note that Bernie Sanders had 3 big wins yesterday in caucuses and primaries, and Alaska, Hawaii, and a big one in Washington State. But Marlon, I mean, he's got more delegates, but it's Hillary Clinton who still appears to be the Democratic nominee.
The Olympics are coming up this summer. She is ahead. It's going to be very difficult for him to catch her. However, there's momentum on his side.
But he's going to have leverage going into the convention on philosophy and which way the party goes, which is left.
Yeah.
And pay attention to Wisconsin, but New York is coming up, Pennsylvania, all the diverse states.
But why does Bernie Sanders do so well in caucuses as opposed to primaries?
Same as Ted Cruz, I don't know. But I think
what is it about that process that he does so well?
I don't know. He mystifies me, but I think he's good in a sense, because that's what the political discourse is supposed to be like in an election. You're not supposed to be denigrating each other's wives or husbands. This is what you're supposed to be doing, and they're doing it.
And caucuses are political discourse. They sit down and they hash it out.
It is real
I went to my
democracy
first caucus in
action.
Iowa. It was great.
All right, we're going to have to end this right here. Thank you all for coming in. What a great discussion. Thanks.
Thank
all right,
you
the
so
governor suspended the chairman of the Broward Health System this week, and that person who was suspended answered with a lawsuit. Local 10 investigator Bob Norman has that story.
This week, Governor Rick Scott suspended David DiPietro. He's the chairman of the board of the Broward Health System, and he fired back with a lawsuit. All of this as Broward's public health network deals with state and federal investigations.
And that suspended board chair, David DiPietro, accuses the governor of interfering with the state investigation, and he says he got kicked out for no good reason. He sat down for an exclusive interview with our Bob Norman.
I have not done anything wrong, and I haven't interfered with anyone.
Republican attorney David DiPietro has filed a lawsuit against Florida Governor Rick Scott, claiming his former friend unlawfully suspended him as chairman of Broward Health.
These are all just trumped up allegations that are just not true.
Scott suspended DiPietro Friday on the recommendation of his chief inspector general, claiming DiPietro was interfering in its state investigation through votes to remove acting CEO Kevin Fusco and to hire a law firm to assist Broward Health in the probe.
When the inspector general says something like that, I'm going to take immediate action.
But DiPietro said the law firm was hired only to make sure the district acted above board and that Fusco was removed after complaints from staff.
Employees of the district feel like they're going to be retaliated against by the general counsel and the CEO, and they feel that the place is going to sink and they asked me to please take action.
It was a surprise move, especially since DiPietro was responsible for uncovering the corruption in the first place. Last year, he recommended hiring a private investigator, Wayne Black, to look into allegations of kickbacks, leading to an ongoing FBI criminal investigation. His attorney, Brian Silber,
was the response by the governor to shut my client down, to get him out of office, and stop that transparency.
The lawsuit demands he be reinstated.
Every single public official in the state of Florida should be aware that what the governor did to me through an executive order with no facts, that they could be removed next.
In Fort Lauderdale, Bob Norman, Local 10 News.
Bob, thanks. All right, still to come, my personal perspective about our jobs governor, Rick Scott.
And this beautiful picture is courtesy of our Hollywood Beach Tower Cam. A beautiful look onto the beach on what looks like a sunny day.
It is a beautiful day, and here is Trent Eric with the official forecast.
Good afternoon, South Florida. I'm meteorologist Trent Eric. Hope you're having a great Easter so far. Today, wind out of the southeast between 10 and 15 miles per hour is going to help push our temperatures well into the mid-80s later on this afternoon. And this area high pressure will keep that warm flow going as the stationary front stays stalled to the north. We'll see just a 10% chance of rain later on this afternoon. As you're planning out your work week over the next 3 days, rain moves back in the forecast Monday and Tuesday. Matter of fact, we'll keep at least an isolated chance of a shower all the way through next weekend.
All right, Trent, thank you. Before we leave you this morning, a personal perspective about our jobs governor, Rick Scott. Hey, I'm glad that he is focused on jobs. Everyone needs a good one. And Lord knows Governor Scott has made jobs his #1 priority, and that's not a bad thing. But the governor has focused on jobs almost to the exclusion of everything else. What about other priorities he should be thinking about and acting on? Education, the environment, traffic congestion, gun violence, to name but a few. Those things matter too, but almost everything Rick Scott does, in public at least, is about one of his soporific jobs announcements. He arrives at the business du jour where he is treated like royalty, gets lots of strokes from the CEO, who then receives a kind of a cheesy medal from the governor. The governor loves these events because he is a businessman at heart, and these are the one place where he is completely comfortable with other business people. Look, we all have our comfort zone. Governor Scott's is very, very narrow. He's the governor for business, but hardly anything else. Instead of flying around the state and visiting only companies that have hired some new workers, why not also visit an exemplary nursing home like the Miami Jewish Home and Hospital, or stop by an award-winning school? And if he's giving out medals, why not give some to the kids in the 5,000 Role Models of Excellence program, or kids who win a debate tournament or a music competition? Attend a Seder next month. And if he's handing out medals for excellence, give one to Michael Tilson Thomas at the New World Symphony. I've never seen Rick Scott do anything like that. Scott is all about jobs, too much so, in my opinion. Our lives are about more than work and jobs. If Rick Scott wants to be Florida's next senator, and I think he does, he's got to be more than the jobs governor. That is my perspective. Hope you have a great Sunday. Happy Easter. Remember, as always, stay informed, get involved.
And absolutely let us know what you think. Weigh in on that or any topic you like. And here are all the addresses at which you can do so.